We welcome you to Introduction to Sociology, and today we shall be doing the interactionist perspective on deviance. Now, the question is, what is interactionist approach? And we know that central to this approach is a notion that deviance is above all a matter of social definition. That is, an alleged behavior or condition is deviant if people say it is. The social aspect of deviance becomes clear when someone perceives another person as departing from accepted norms, interprets the person to be some kind of a deviant, and influences others also to regard the person as deviant and to act on the basis of that interpretation. As a social phenomenon, then, deviance consists of a set of interpretations and social reactions. As we have said that, what is a deviant? Now, deviant is a person who deviates, who violates the accepted norms of the society. Now, an individual will be deviant only if the society believes or thinks that the norms have been flouted or they have been infracted. Otherwise, the individual will not become a deviant. So, you understand that deviance is something which is not a crime. It is not something which has a legal sanction, but it is only something when we go outside the given structure of the society. When society feels that, when individuals are also labeled as deviant, and the deviants also come to believe that they have flouted the social norms, and that kind of interaction decides how the society will look at the deviant, and the deviant also tries to understand how they should behave. So that entire process creates a kind of a deviance. Now, can you think of an example of a deviant? Now, anybody, suppose we all write with our right hand. Any person who writes with the left hand can be a deviant, but then that doesn't mean that there is legal sanctions upon him. It is only that he is going against the wind. Constructing deviance. When people are constructed as being deviant, they are usually regarded as being a particular type of deviant. These types may be general, for example, ex-convict, mentally ill, sexually loose, retarded, or they may be more specific. For example, car thief, paranoid, schizophrenic, call girl, a person with Down syndrome, etc. Whether these levels are general or specific, they usually suggest what one can expect of the so-called deviant and how one should act towards him or her. For example, with suspicion, avoidance, vigilance, or vengeance. And in coming to terms with such labeling, the deviants may revise their self-concept and their actions in accordance with the ways they have been labeled. For example, a child who has been typed by school authorities as having a speech problem may become self-conscious. Now, what is important here, learners, that how we construct our situation. So, deviance is something which is being socially constructed at one particular point of time. Deviance can be general or they can be specific. How general? For instance, if I say a bad girl, a fallen girl, morally suspect. If I say somebody is absolutely sexually loose, mentally challenged or ill. Now all these are what? They are general terms. We can also come to more specific terms such as somebody with schizophrenia, somebody with Down syndrome. Now these are again very specific problems. So whatever it is, whenever we are using such terms, we are actually labeling it. And once we label it, it creates a dual process. It tells the society how they should be reacting to these people, behaving to these people, and the deviants themselves also become conscious as how they should react to such responses. So, in the symbolic interactionism, which you must be knowing because we had been doing it for quite a long time, that symbolic interactionists do what? They say that self is created and self is something which is flexible. It is created through its interaction with the audience. And we get to know from the audience what we are supposed to behave like. There is something given to us. There is nothing called a fixture, but what or how we should react. For instance, in a school, if a child has some speech problem, For instance, he stammers a lot, and the teacher says or bullies, the friends bully them, or the teacher say, you have a speech therapy problem, you need a speech therapy, you have some speech problem, then the child, it's very natural, will be reacting to these responses from the teacher and will also consider himself as a shy, very introvert, and maybe he'll develop other kind of learning problems. The interactionist perspective focuses on just issues as this: how people label one another, how they relate to one another on the basis of these labels, and the consequence of these social processes. As such, the interactionist perspective helps immensely in our understanding not only of the sociology of deviance but also of the social process. Now, there are 4 sections in our discussion. As I've already said that creating label is very important, and it is through creating labels that we are relating to one another. We are creating a kind of stereotypes. What is stereotype? That is the given way of acting towards something. And a schizophrenic know that people call him a schizophrenic and how they should react towards that. So there's a fixed response and the way of adjustment to those responses once they get it from the society. So that is how individuals relate to one another and adjust their living in the society. This is what is known as a social process. Now, there are 4 sections in our discussions which we need to zero in on. Now, what are they? First half of the discussion deals with how people define some person as deviant and act on the basis of these definitions. The second section deals with these processes in the formal regulation of the deviance. For example, it considers how agents of social control, such as the police, define person as deviant, how they act on these definitions, and what some of these consequences of formal actions are. The second section of the discussion also discusses deviants themselves, how they respond to being typed by others, how they type themselves, and how they relate to their deviants, other deviants. The third section discusses the social organization of deviance and how people get into a deviant group and learn its norms. The fourth section shows how persons may take on the deviant identities through self-typing, how they manage the deviant identities, and how they become eventually more respectable. This module then discusses not on people's motivation for doing things that are regarded as deviant, but rather on the sociology of deviance, the process that divides society into different types of people. See, as we say that in symbolic interactionism, self is very important, and self is something which is created because we try to attach importance to the objects in front of us, to the things in front of us, and things become objects. And that is how we respond to our own self, we create our own self. In the similar fashion, we also say that deviant people have their own identity. They create their own self-espousals or their own self-identity, and how they try to, you label yourself, and how they come to be reinforced in that particular group because they get used to it and they also interact with others to find out how they should respond to others. And through this process of getting an identity for themselves, in this process of identity formation, they also try to gain the respectability back in the society because nobody wants to be tagged very inferior by a particular label. So how they restore back that respectability, that is also quite important here. And the fourth point that we are trying to say is it is an absolute process of deviance, the process through which different types of labels are created, and that is how society is differentiated, hierarchized into different, different labels or between different tags, and that is what cuts across the society, cuts across through the belly of the society. The social deviant. Sociology is a study of social relations, and sociologists study how people arrive at common constructions of their situation, how they form groups based on such constructions, and how they go on to set down their rules of conduct, assign social roles to each other, and enforce their roles. Sociologists examine these questions as part of the larger question. How do people attempt to produce and sustain social order? Deviance implies an alleged breach of a social norm. And by looking at deviance, we can come to a better understanding of the social interaction. At the same time, the study of deviance also sheds light on the way deviant patterns and lifestyles are organized. So, sociology is basically a study of social relations, as we all know, and sociologists will try to come to an understanding that how these collective norms and group dictates are formed. Because only when we violate these group norms or violate these group sanctions, then only we are called a deviant. So we need to know how this, this collectivity is formed and organized, how these rules are set down, who assigns roles to one another, and how stubborn are these roles. And therefore, we also try to answer this question, that particularly after having constructed this particular straitjacket, how do you go on breaking it? And how do individuals try to maintain the social order by conforming to this order? And in case they do not or are not able to conform to this order, that often leads to a breach, and how individuals react to it. Now, so the question we are also trying to answer is that the patterns of deviance that is created to society and also the approach towards it. Now, we have two similar kinds of approach. I won't say similar, but in the case of symbolic interactionism, when we are trying to, define interactionism or deviance, we are trying to say that there are two approaches. One is the objective approach, and one is the subjective approach. Now, what is the objective approach? Objective approach is how society acts to the individual, and the individual knows that there are particular things that they will have to act towards. And subjectively is what individual thinks about it. It is not what society thinks, because things are given and things are absolutely fixed. But whenever it is subjective, it is the individual, it's the actor who decides how they will act to it, what should be its consequences, how they should respond to the sanctions of the society. So it is they, the individual, the social actor, the social performer, who takes into consideration his self and becomes more powerful. Let's look at the social definitions. On the basis of these assumptions, sociologists use this perspective to focus on social definitions and how this influences social interaction. On the one hand, they focus on the perspective and actions of those who define a person as being deviant. They look at the circumstances under which a person is most likely to set apart as deviant, how a person is cast into a deviant role, what actions others take on the basis of the construction of a person, and the consequences of these actions. On the other hand, these sociologists also focus on the perspective and reactions of the person adjudged to be deviant. They consider how a person reacts to being so adjudged, how a person adopts a deviant role, what changes in group membership results, and what changes occur in the alleged deviance self-concept. As I was talking about the objective and the subjective part. So objectively, it is society which makes an individual deviant, which creates a lot of norms which are only sustained and ushered by the society. The society tells you under what circumstances you need to act and in what situation. And it also tells you what deviant role an individual has been assigned by the society. And it is on the construction of the deviant role that an individual is supposed to behave. But when you come to the subjective side, you realize that as an individual, how you judge yourself. It is not just societies judging you as deviant, but you as an individual also has a lot of responses to give. So how you are reacting to it, how you are setting yourself, that is an important question that we are asking. And what changes when you get membership into a particular gang or into a particular deviant? How does your life change? How your roles remain important, and how does it change over time? When people hear that a person has broken a rule, they are likely to ask, what kind of person would do a thing like that? What they have heard other people say in the past about deviance leads them to designate the alleged rule breaker as a certain kind of a deviant social type. When researchers study the records of people who have committed crimes or who are patients in mental hospitals, they also classify the offenders or the patients into certain categories. In both instances, whether talking about or studying those thought to have broken the rules, a construction of the kind of people who violate rules is supported, shared, and transmitted for use in future communications about similar actors. So what is important is in symbolic interactionism, lot goes about communication. We try to develop an image about a social level from hearing from the others what exactly it is like. So how do psychopaths look like? How bisexuals are? Who are actually homosexuals? And whether these are deviants, and how should people look towards them, treat them? So that is mostly communicated through our interaction with others. The result is a cultural catalogue of different of social types. Howard S. Becker, in his classical book Outsiders, Study in the Sociology of Deviance, points out that the only thing all people so categorized have in common is the fact that they have all been labeled as deviant. Thus, his definition, deviant behavior is behavior that people label deviant. And for labeling to take place, there have to be responses of the other people who may apply negative sanctions of one kind or another. He goes on to point out the variety of conditions under which labeling takes place, along with the consequences. On the other hand, many people break rules and are never labeled. On the other hand, some are falsely accused. So time, place, the status of the rule, the person being considered, and the rule enforcer are all contingencies. So in order to be labeled, there must be the society or a control agent, social control agent, who is imposing negative sanctions over you and upon you, and to which you are actually acting. So what Howard S. Becker was saying is there are different options to it, there are different patterns to it. Some people who flout the rules and they are called a deviant. Some people who do not flout the rules, but despite that they are falsely accused as a deviant. Again, there are people who flout the rules, but society cannot nab them, society cannot pin them, and society cannot put a deviant tag on them. So there are different permutation and combination of the way we tag people and give them the label of deviance. Now, crime against persons use all force and are examples of voluntary deviance. Persons who freely choose to perform these acts arouse moral indignation as well as criminal sanctions. On the other hand, involuntary deviance is more apt to evoke negative social sanctions and criminal sanctions. Nevertheless, involuntary deviance, through their actions of their appearance, violate the taken for granted expectations of everyday life. A construction of socially deviant, although involuntary, so still produces many of the consequences that labeling theory predicts. Druan Maria Heckert and Amy Best interviewed people with red hair, and they found that being born with red hair produced a negative consequence that labeling theory suggests. Red-haired youths, when interacting with the peers who acted on their stereotyped beliefs about the people with red hair, found their character, competence, and confidence called into question. Some people who are born with red hair and there is nothing they can change it. But often they say in the interview, they have reported that they have been taken with mockery, with shame, with vengeance, with wrath, with all sorts of social stigma. So these people are usually being labeled as redheads, and they also suffer from different kinds of social fear, social ostracism, or social ridicule. Labeling theory can account for the treatment of the red hair and the redheads. As we have seen that they have been stigmatized in the society, and there's always different kind of labels that go with them, such as flaring temper, clowishness, weirdness, Irish ethnicity, a need to avoid the sun, etc. So all these are stereotype notions and beliefs that we have, harvested and harnessed for the people with the red hair. Next, we'll come to the wheelchair users. Again, wheelchair users are also deviant in the kind that they cannot walk and they have to use the ramp. Wherever they go, cinema halls or hospitals, any kind of medical treatment, they have to use the wheelchairs. But often we find that there is a lot of stigma into it, that you cannot use your own limbs. You do not have locomotive power very well and you have to depend upon your wheelchair. Unless people work in the institutions of social control, such as religion, law, or medicine, they are not likely to have had any personal contact with more serious social deviants, such as criminals or psychotics. Thus, any ideas they have about flagrant violators of legal or moral norms have come to them through conversations with friends or family or from the major communications media. Depictions of deviant social times from these sources may consist of negative stereotypes. By contrast, one's chances of coming into contact with the everyday variety of deviance are much greater. Therefore, the chances of interacting with people who regularly violate social norms about dress, adornment, beliefs, and appearances are much greater. It is said that often we do not come into situations where we get to look a lot of, or where we get to meet a lot of deviants. Especially if you're in the medical background, if you have a medical background or health or religion or law, you need to, or you meet several people with such deviations and you don't mock at them. Because at that point of time, you know to empathize with the people. You know what it feels like to be without one's limb, or to be a crippled person to be on the wheelchair. Therefore, this kind of associations, verbal associations or non-verbal associations with people who are deviant helps you a lot. Because other people will take them as somebody who needs to be avoided, as somebody who's a burden upon others. And when we invite people to our own homes, we avoid people, who have this kind of locomotive problems. We don't want to invite them to our homes because we'll say, oh my God, I have a lift, I do not have a ramp. So how do I call this person in my home? Instead, if you have been into more communication with such people, or if you had that interactionism within yourself, if you had been able to put yourself in the role of the other, you should have invited that person in your house. So that is how the responses differ. Labeling the mentally retarded. Two viewpoints seem to prevail when it comes to thinking about deviance. Laymen as well as students of the subject blame deviant behavior either on the person or on the social environment. The medical model locates the source of deviance in characteristics of the person. A number of sociological theories of deviant behavior locate the sources of deviance in the characteristics of people's social environment. The interactionist perspective can combine both the viewpoints by arguing that deviance turns out to be the result of transactions between individual and the persons in the individual social environment. So when you are a functionalist, when you have a more straitjacket approach, you will say that deviance occurs only because of the factors in the social environment upon which I will have no control or any kind of a say. But if you are an interactionist, you will probably say that not just that the factors which cause that deviance, but the factors juxtaposed with the way individuals interact and respond towards the social environment, that creates a kind of a social deviance. So your opinion or your viewpoint will change. The interactionist perspective focuses on the official construction of deviance that are current in different social situations. The agents of control who apply those constructions and the responses of those who are implicated in these levels of deviance. Jen R. Mercer compares and contrasts the ways in which high status and low status families respond to their children if they have a low IQ. The findings lend support to the relativity of Devine's generalization. That some families suspect that a child is different and seek confirmation of their suspicions from specialists. Others perceive that agents of control are imposing an official definition of deviance. They are less likely that the first set of families to accept the official construction. So if somebody says that my child suffers from less IQ, there may be two ways that I am reacting to the situation. I might say that there are situational problems where my child is not able to adapt to the environment. So I need to go and see a consultant. Maybe a mental counselor will help my child be bailed out of the situation. Or I might interpret it in another way, that the teachers are not behaving rightly with that person, with my child. The agents of social control are not that flexible, they are more imposing. So it is how I will take that into my point of view. We can study the conditions of shame, embarrassment and stigma a person might anticipate after a bowel movement becomes public. They found that heterosexual men and non-heterosexual women evince the least concern after exposure of their mishaps in toilet etiquette. On the other side, outside of the gender and sexual identity divide, they found that the heterosexual women and non-heterosexual men evince the most concern. So, simple things when they are supposed to be done in a private place, but certain things when suddenly they comes out in the public area and you become absolutely ridiculed by the others, it is in a different way that individuals or the groups react to it. As I had said that men and the women, they have different kind of toilet etiquettes, okay, and suddenly such as a discharge of the fecal matter, which is a very private thing. For instance, vomiting, which is supposed to be a very private matter. If suddenly one vomits in the train compartment or in the classroom, just a few days back, my child, she's such a small girl, she peed in the class and that was such an embarrassment. So small things, they becomes a huge things and they explode into a large thing if you do not know how to interact on the particular situation, because those things have been perceived as different. So that depends upon how you interact with the situation and the different components that are there embedded in the environment that decides your response to it. Medical diagnosis and the reinforcement of deviant labels, the interactionist perspective holds that both person's self and a person's social role arise in the course of social interaction. Thus, parents train their female children to act like young women, and in times these youngsters come to see themselves in this way and behave accordingly. By the same token, deviant selves and roles also arise in social interaction. This is an example of, as I've said in my next thing, is a sexual transmitted disease. How they are transmitted, more importantly, how individuals are labeled for it. And because women or girls are taken to be extremely docile and they're socialized in the similar way, and if they're diagnosed with an STD and the doctor becomes very suspicious towards that girl, but you see that suspicion will not come into a man, because even if he's transmitted with such a disease, because he is supposed to be more macho. So these perceptions depend upon my labeling, how I label a girl, which is very different from how I've labeled a boy. This is deviance in urban schools. Edward W. Morris's study of the enforcement of the dress code in an urban middle school is a case in point. The school he described prescribed a strict dress code and then set about enforcing it. But as Morris points out, school officials and teachers had shared perspective that led to a pattern of selective perception and enforcement. Latino and African American boys were more likely to be labeled deviant and punished more severely for dress code violations, as were African American and Latin girls. By contrast, white and Asian American boys and girls were less often assigned a deviant status. So, such breaches were quite often. And when you go to a school which is multi-ethnic, where different kind of communities and races and different genders, a multicultural setup where people study together, it is very important how teachers react towards you, how teachers interact with the students. So maybe, some people, the black children, whom are called niggards, often they are, ridiculed in that way. And the teachers say that, oh, they are the school dropout, they are lazy, they don't do their homeworks properly. So what happens is it actually doesn't, the teachers may think that rebuking the child, the teacher may think that rebuking the child may work, but it doesn't work, because deviants become more and more reinforced. I try to believe that I myself is a deviant, and in no way my teacher can help me. If my parents go on rebuking me always, scolding me always, I become a member of the deviant group. That becomes reinforced within me, and I don't want to change it. Acquiring a deviant identity. When deviance happens for a long time and you become embedded within it, you start developing an identity within yourself. You start being a deviant yourself when you enjoy your status, which is very interesting, and you don't want to change it. Whatever be it, I have acquired my new found identity and I don't want to change it. People acquire deviant identities in what is often a long drawn out interactive process. For example, a person performs a deviant act for the first time and then others respond to the act, usually with some form of social punishment. But when this goes on and on and on, when the punishment happens and there is no way I can be bailed out of the situation, people go on giving their negative sanctions against me, I become a hardcore deviant. I'll end with this: anorexia, bulimia, and developing a deviant identity. Some answers to these questions in their comparisons of anorexics and bulimics. They say some young women take action to change the way they think they look in the eyes of the other people, in particular young men. Significant others, such as family or friends, see the patterned actions they take to become attractive as being deviant. So what happens? These different methods lead to variations in both the application of the deviant label by family and friends and the acceptance of those labels. Given these different circumstances, bulimics are more apt to accept their deviant activity and identity and to conceal their being and purging from others. Now, what is anorexia and bulimia? Some usually models and some very aspiring youngsters and girls, they want to be extremely thin and slim, in that way they are actually trying to losing their weight, and they do it not in a very rigorous way or in a scientific way. What they do is they go for fasting, they go for pucking, they go for vomiting, whatever food they have had for themselves, they just vomit it out in order to sustain that size 0 figure for themselves. So that way, it often leads to physical weakness, different kinds of physical problems as well as mental depression. But this is a deviant identity that they have formed for themselves, and it's very difficult for them to come out of it. I think I have been able to explain you what is deviance and what are the different outcomes of it, different outbreaks of it. Thank you so much. This is how I want to conclude.